Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Tough topic. Let's do it. What's something effed up you witnessed as a child, but didn't realize the severity of it until you were older? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My parents divorced when I was 3 years old because they started using crystal meth together, and my mom got hooked. Dad told her to get help or he was leaving, and she chose to move in with their meth dealer, marrying him several years later. Dad got custody of us, and that was its own negative situation, though Dad never got high again, and neither did his second wife, so at least that part was better. But in the first few years, we still spent a lot of time with Mom in the drug house. This included that, during the summer, we were with Mom full time, only seeing Dad or his family on Wednesdays and every other weekend. The first few years after the divorce were the worst, using-wise amongst my mom and my stepdad. In the autumn when I was 6, they had a baby, a little boy. I ended up being the one that cared for him when I was over there, as Mom and stepdad were often too high to bother to care for him correctly, and they taught me how. Anyway, the summer after the baby was born, I'm 6, my sister is 5, and the baby is about 7 to 8 months old or so. My sister and I were outside playing when she complained that her toe hurt. Mom was awake, so I took my sister to tell her. My sister always had a very low tolerance for pain, and she became aggressive when my mom tried to look at it. Being high, my mom ended up slapping a band-aid on it without really looking at it, and telling my sister it was going to be just fine. Sister still complained that her toe hurt a little bit, but we were able to go on as normal. Fast forward a couple of days. Sister is still complaining. Mom has been awake for about 3 days. My mom and I cornered my sister in the bathroom and tried to hold her down to look at her toe. My sister was kicking, biting, and screaming bloody murder. Mom decided to just forget about it and leaves my sister with a still sore toe. She crashes from her meth high a few hours later, and we know she's going to be out for a while. Often she would crash and sleep for 24 to 27 hours straight. But we're little, so we're sure that my sister is going to be fine. The next morning, I woke up to get the baby a bottle and tried to wake my sister up. She was literally gray. She could barely open her eyes. She refused to get out of bed or even talk to me. I was scared. I fed the baby a bottle and went to check on sister. Still gray, still not talking, still can't really open her eyes. I realized I needed to do something. I snuck into my mom's room, where she and my stepdad were still sleeping soundly, and I stole her cell phone. I called my dad's mom and told her I thought sister was really sick and she needed to come get us. She asked me where mom was, and I told her she was sleeping, and I couldn't wake her up or she'd be mad at me. She asked me to try anyway, but I couldn't get mom to wake up. Grandma said she was coming. She called my other grandma to come pick up my baby brother. Grandma got to her, waited with us until my other grandma picked up my baby brother, and then we went straight to a clinic at the hospital Grandma worked at. Sister was so sick, she couldn't even try to be aggressive with them. I was in the room of the doctor's office with them to answer questions because Sister couldn't. I explained to him that she hurt her toe and she got a band-aid for a couple of days. But she just wouldn't get up this morning. He took the band-aid off her toe, and I saw his face go pale. He told my grandma to look, and my sister's toe was blue, like the color of mold. Her foot was bright red, and there were like lines, I guess, snaking up her foot into the lower leg that were bright red. I remember thinking they looked like spider legs. He looked at my grandma and told her, "This little girl needs surgery right now." So my grandma tried to get a hold of my dad at work, but he worked at a factory, and she was unable to reach him. They couldn't reach Mom either. They let my grandma sign the consents because of the severity of the situation. She had cellulitis, and it was spreading. She could lose her leg or even her life. I was too little to understand what that really meant, but my grandma tried to explain the best she could that Sister's toe was what was sick, and they might have to cut parts of Sister off to make her less sick. When they took her into surgery, that's where it got even worse. Grandma didn't know Sister was allergic to penicillin, and since she couldn't get a hold of our parents, she had no way to tell the medical staff. Sister had an anaphylactic reaction on the surgery table. At the end, Sister had to have her toe amputated, and she stayed about a week in the hospital. Grandma and Dad helped to be sure that I could stay with her, And I remember we had a lot of fun with me pushing her in a wheelchair to the pediatric unit's game room where we played a bunch of video games together while she recovered. I also remember the original doctor coming to tell me that I saved my sister's life. But I didn't know what that meant at the time. I was little enough, and the crazy situations were normalized enough for me that I didn't question how serious it was. Sister's toe got sick. They removed it. She's not gray anymore, and sometimes this stuff happens. We're both now in our 30s, and I work as a substance abuse counselor. I've heard a lot of heinous cases of child abuse and neglect, but to this day, I've never had a client tell me their negligence or abuse led to the literal amputation of any of their children's body parts. It's the most insane addiction story I've heard of to date. No one should have to go through what you and your sister and stepbrother endured. I mean, I'm glad your sister's okay, and I'm glad you guys turned out great. So, sorry. Had a sleepover pizza party with a couple of cops when I was around 4. Thought it was just something cops did at everyone's house in town. Didn't realize it was a police protection detail till years later when I heard my mom talking about the time 2 cops showed up thinking my dad died. My dad fired a guy at work for showing up drunk again. Guy went home, killed his wife and kids, and went to an off-the-grid cabin estate over to kill himself. Not knowing where the guy was at the time, my dad was considered a potential target till the body was discovered. I remember cuddling up with my mom when she had a brace on her nose. It's the kind you have after a surgery, and we talked about her nasal surgery. It took like 10 years later before I realized that the reason for the corrective surgery was my dad's fist. My youth pastor, or youth group leader, used to share porn with me after everyone else in the group had left. I was 15 to 16 when I started, and a horny little bastard who had no access to adult material at home, late 90s dial-up on the shared computer in a public space. He was a postal employee and minister in training. It carried on until I was 18, and started dating the girl who would go on to become my wife. I just took it in stride that he was being cool and sharing something I wanted with me because he had it. It got weird one time when he left me in his office with a video playing and told me to take my time, toss some paper towels in, and then came back to check on me. I didn't do anything except watch. It was awkward AF, and then he saw I was nervous and gave me a weird hug. I chalked it up to nerves on my part. My perspective changed when he accepted a role in another church and had to move. He was trying to get rid of his stuff and wanted to give it to me. I was interested until my roommate in college said it was effed up, which made me take a step back and realize how inappropriate it was. In 2019, he was charged with attempted R, and SA of a minor, and finally this year pled guilty to all charges for a grand total of 3 years in state prison. I'd come forward as a witness and got interviewed by the police and his defense attorney's investigator. I was prepared to make a statement or testify if I had to, but really didn't want to have this part of my life made public. Thankfully, because we were all minors when it happened, our names were withheld and the prosecutor chose not to include charges associated with me because there was no physical harm done. Looking back, I know other people who might have been involved with or abused by him. With 20 plus years of hindsight, I was lucky I was so dumb and didn't let myself fall completely under his spell. I had this friend as about a 10-year-old kid who lived in a trailer park during the summers. We would pretty much just roam the neighborhood all day or do whatever, and our parents would have no clue where we were. One day, he decided to run inside to get some toy or whatever, and I followed. I saw his mom passed out on the couch, a needle hit me. And this kid, who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, was just like, "Oh yeah, she's like that all the time," in the most nonchalant tone. At the time, I was like, "Okay, grab your toy and let's go." Now thinking back, it just breaks my heart. I was sitting on the couch at 5 years old when my parents started arguing, and my mom threw a red book at my dad. Just thought it was a fight. Turns out, it was their pre-divorce fight after my dad caught her cheating. Didn't learn about the cheating until I was 16, and only recently learned it was a brick that she threw at him. Okay, so mom cheated, dad caught her, and she threw a brick at him? Sounds good. My classmate in 3rd grade, who I'd known since kindergarten, asked me to follow her home after school because she was scared. She also started flinching to fist bumps around that time, to any fist really. After the school made some deal out of me escorting her home and heading back to school to wait for my mom to pick me up, I never saw her again. I'm guessing the father was abusive, but I'll never know. One of my earliest memories is my sister attempting to suffocate me with a pillow. She's 9 years older than me, and for a solid chunk of my childhood and into my teens, it just sort of hung out in the back of my head, and it was a story she would tell about teaching me to play peekaboo. Then our brother, 10 years older than me, told the story from his perspective and how he learned he couldn't leave me alone with her. My last foster dad said, "I don't have to worry about what happens to you foster kids because I can always get another one, and you are covered on state insurance." This was regarding serious injuries when working on his land and small farm. We already been to the ER that summer 3 times, including dropping a fence post driver on the kid's head and splitting it open. And myself having a barbed wire fence stretch so tight that it snapped on me, sliced me open in my hands pretty badly, but could have ripped open my stomach. At the time, I laughed it off as logical because he was right that he didn't have to pay for our medical bills. As an adult, I realized how seriously effed up it was that he was treating us as outright expendable if we had life-altering injuries, and how much he only wanted us for labor. I was adopted. Due to being an orphan, I didn't get the social interaction as other kids. Fast forward to being adopted and meeting with girls and boys in the neighborhood. A rumor ran around I was incapable of feeling pain or reacting to it. Well, 2 of these girls decided to test this. They took scissors and cut my face with the straight blade. I don't remember this. I only have what my parents had told me, and what I had supposed told them when I came home. According to them, my lack of reaction to pain or blood freaked the girls out, and I had refused to ever play with me again after. I was maybe 4 to 6 at the time. I was in a self-contained room for special ed for years because of my disability, visual. I watched a kid with Tourette's be forcibly restrained because he got up to back away from a teacher who didn't like his vocal tick. She called in the assistant principal, who decided to try to lift and carry him out of the room. He was just standing there, no reason for this to be done. And she did this maneuver where he ended up falling forward. His face hit the desk so hard it moved the desk. Instead of giving him aid, she snapped at him that maybe he shouldn't have done that. He went to hospital, and I never saw him again. I watched another kid get beaten by a paraprofessional in the name of restraint. He was taken to the coat room, back room in the classroom, and I heard him hit the wall hard. I watched my best friend at the time climb a fence to avoid our teacher, who yanked her down and slapped her, and then turned to me and told me to go to the wall. My head pinged off the brick. My head pinged off a lot of stuff because of teachers. I was routinely grabbed, slapped, my hair pulled, my head held in a certain direction, screamed at, once cornered and beaten for not being able to say something. This is back in the day when they would lump all the disabled kids together. They knew how to hurt you without leaving bruises. They knew what to do to get you to not tell your parents. If you did, the punishments would get creative in the name of therapy. I witnessed a lot of verbal, emotional, mental abuse. What a terrible situation, and I'm sorry you had to endure and witness all that, even with a visual impairment, but hopefully all of those people are far away from children now. When I was a kid, we took a family trip to Las Vegas and stayed at Circus. My mom went to get a magnet of a souvenir from Caesar's Palace, so we parked somewhere and went inside. I want to say we might have parked in an area reserved for staff, or it could have been for guests or visitors. That part is very fuzzy. My parents didn't care regardless and had never been there. When we were walking back to the car and over a sewer grate, the kind with slots, I sneezed. A gruff male voice from below in the sewer said, "Bless you." Being an innocent kid, I said thanks as my parents hurried my brother and I into the rental car. Years later, as an adult, I watched a documentary about homeless people who live in the Las Vegas sewers. usually drug addicts and even women hiding from pimps. In it, when they're inside one of the sewer tunnels, their guide pointed up at the sewer grate above them and said, "You see this? This is the parking lot of Caesar's palace." That whole realization that I was there as a kid gave me whiplash. My 7th grade English teacher accidentally gave me a document he had written. It was on an old floppy disk he assumed it was blank. It described how he volunteered with a humanitarian group in the 70s that traveled through impoverished countries and provided free vasectomies. They eventually trained him how to do it, and he would do them, even though he had no real medical training. This is not even the messed up part. He goes on to explain that he decides that he wanted a vasectomy and to do it himself. He then described in very graphic detail how he did it to himself. He even said the date, like March 1st, 1981 or something like that. He described in detail cutting through things and how rubbery it felt. Again, not the effed up part. I thought the story was hilarious because he wrote scrotum so many times. And I was a 7th grader. Well, I spread the story around to my friends. It eventually spread to a parent that shared it with the school. His wife, who was also a teacher there, promptly quit. Their son, who was younger than me, born in the 90s, also left the school. He kept his job. What I figured out much later was that his wife had cheated on him and had gotten pregnant, but pretended like it was his. The effed up part is that he obviously knew she cheated but never told her. He had raised the boy as his own son. Once she realized he was sterile, and he's known the entire time, she left him and took the kid. Had I not shared that story, that kid could have lived his entire life without knowing, and that family could have stayed together.